Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to begin within the next minute or two. Just waiting for a few more people to log in. Thanks. Hi, everyone. We're going to begin now. I'd like to welcome you to the first of two webinars with Renee Rubin-Ross. Just a few things before we start. We're going to leave about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the webinar to answer your questions. I have a list of questions people submitted from the pre-survey, but if you have a question, please hold it to the end. You can use the chat box and send it to me, and I'll just keep a running list. Also, a recording of this webinar will be available on jcca.me. You could find this under the webinar library in our professional development knowledge base. And if you need any help finding this or accessing the recording, you could contact me and I'll send you my email at the end. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Renee Rubin-Ross. Dr. Ross works with nonprofit organizations to tell the story of their accomplishments and plan for the future, strengthening fundraising, communication, and overall effectiveness. Her consulting practice includes strategic planning, governance, and board training, and grant writing. Ross teaches grant proposal writing at Cal State University in East Bay and is the director of Nonprofit Management Certificate Program. From 2011 to 2014, Ross served as a program officer at the Jim Joseph Foundation.
Great. Thank you, Sarah, for the intro. So just to tell you a little bit, this is Renee Rubin-Ross. Just to tell you a little bit more about myself, I work with grants in a lot of different ways. As Sarah mentioned, I was a program officer at the Jim Joseph Foundation, and I oversaw a $10 million portfolio. So I have some understanding of why some grants get funded and others don't. Currently, I do strategic planning, board development work, and grant writing. I teach grant writing, and I also coach nonprofit executives who may have parts of a grant writing process and need some support and coaching to get a grant to the finish line. And on a more personal note, among the many JCCs I've been connected to over the years, I grew up at Camp Raphael, summer day camp at the Marin JCC in San Rafael, California, now called the Osher JCC. It's fun to be on the webinar with you today and share some of my knowledge to help your JCC strengthen its work. And we wanted to thank you to the many of you who did the pre-webinar survey that helped us know more about your interest in grants. I'm going to be incorporating your survey feedback into the presentation, and if you didn't do it, don't worry. So I've shared a little bit about myself, and we're interested in hearing about you. If you could let us know in the chat box about your comfort level with the grant writing process, grant proposal writing process. Could you tell us, are you very experienced? Would you describe yourself as very experienced, know something, or know little? And you can just type it into the chat box.
So I see we have a wide variety of know little, know something, very experienced, absolutely nothing, know a little more than something, very little,
Okay.
medium, so a little bit of everything.
Great, great. So, and that's also what came out in the pre-webinar survey. We're aware that there are a range of experience levels here on the webinar, that some people are not familiar with grants. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be giving a quick overview of the basics, and then I'm going to share specific suggestions for strengthening the grant proposal process for those of you who are more advanced. So, I'm going to talk about grant proposal writing and fundraising in terms of taking the first step. My hope is that I will share some material with you that will help you know more about grant proposal writing. I'm going to share a lot of material. For some people, some of this may be review. For others, most of this may be new. And the way that I think of this is, for someone who wants to start an exercise routine, you're not going to go out the first day and run a marathon. If you want to eat more healthy, you're probably not going to be successful if you start by going through your kitchen and throwing all your food away, all your unhealthy food away. But rather, any successful plan starts with one first step. For a new exerciser, that might be putting your walking shoes by the door. For someone trying to eat healthy, that might be subbing in one smaller, healthier habit for a less healthy one. So similarly, I'm going to give you many different steps you can take. And at the end of the hour, towards the end of the hour, I'm going to ask you, what's your first step to a fundable grant proposal going to be? My goal is that you will have identified one next step of the many that I suggest for your JCC's grant writing or fundraising program. So this is our agenda. I'm going to do a brief introduction to the grant proposal writing process, and then I'm going to go through the 5 steps to a fundable grant proposal: thoughtful program design, detailed funder research, relationship-based funder research, creating a compelling needs statement, creating clear goals and objectives, and then at the end, I'll allow some time for there'll be a brief conclusion, and I'll allow some time for questions. So just to understand, what kinds of proposal ideas are you thinking about? And to be concrete about this, if you could put in the chat box what kinds of ideas you're thinking about. What is a project or program for which you're interested in seeking grant funding?
Okay, I'm seeing a lot. Dance performance, cultural arts series and specific programs, fitness classes, forest management and camp property, veteran programs, special needs inclusion, cultural arts, youth programming, aquatics, young leadership engagement.
Great. Okay. So there are a lot of different ideas coming in, and a lot of these came in on the in the survey also. And I'm going to talk throughout the webinar. I'm going to talk in more detail about seeking funding for some of these different ideas. So I will start out with a brief overview of what is grant funding, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. What is a grant proposal? First of all, a grant proposal is a written form of communication between an organization and a grant maker. The grant maker could be a foundation, government entity, a corporation, or an individual. Your JCC makes a request for funds and explains how they'll be used in your grant proposal. How do you get a grant? You receive a grant by asking for one. Grants are reviewed and evaluated in a competitive process. And as we'll talk about in a few minutes, sometimes you submit a letter of inquiry first, which might be 2 to 4 pages. Sometimes you submit a full proposal. Letter of inquiry is about the essence of your program idea. Many grant applications are now online. They often have length limits or word counts, which you should not exceed even by 1 word. Okay, so this is a really important slide. If you look at this slide, this is the total of charitable giving, not including funding from government, to nonprofit organizations. It was, in 2016, about $390 billion. And if you look at this slide, what you see is that 72% of charitable giving came from individuals, only 15% from foundations. So what does that mean? As a nonprofit, you should be investing 72% of your time and energy in individual donations. This past weekend, I went to the annual meeting of my synagogue, Nitivot Shalom in Berkeley, and we're seeking, like almost every organization, we're seeking to expand our budget and to have more money to do so, as I'm sure all of you are. And so there were this chorus of people asking about grants, and it was like, if we could only get a grant, we'd have enough money to do everything. And what I want to say is that there are myths about grants out there. Grants are not the magic bullet. Grants can bring in large sums of money, but they are expensive. They take a lot of time and planning. There's a long grant cycle, so it might take 9 months to a year or even several years to receive money from a grant. So if I'm not necessarily recommending that you apply for a grant, how can the information that I'm sharing today help you? There's a couple of ways. First of all, I'll be talking about strategically building your program based on community needs. You can use these steps to write a letter of inquiry to individual donors. And the principles of making the case for your program are the same, whether you use them for foundations or individuals. And these steps should help you get clear about why you're choosing the approach you're choosing. So just a little more information about grants. There are different kinds of grants. Government grants are, in 2014, were over $198 billion. Private foundations, about a third of that. This number is from 2016. Some people I know in the survey said that they are applying for government grants. Government grants are very much more involved, longer applications, and that could be somewhere between 30 to 100 pages. So what's the first step? Detailed, thoughtful program design. So this is a diagram of the grant proposal cycle. And the headline here is put down your pen. Although no one really uses pens anymore, you could say put down your computer. Grant proposal writing, at least for a little while, grant proposal writing does not start with writing. It starts with the development of a program or project idea. So the first step in getting funding is designing a high quality, much needed program. So before you look outward to funders, and I know there were a lot of questions about finding funders, but before you start thinking about funders and filling out your applications and all of that, you want to be looking inward at your JCC and thinking about questions like, what do we do well? What could we do better? So it might be, we have a great after-school program, but we don't have much capacity to serve seniors. Or we have a vibrant senior fitness program, but we don't have a strong youth fitness program. You think about what have you heard from the community? Many people we've spoken with have asked for a women's sports program. Seems to be a community need. And after you've done some thoughtful program development, that's when you're ready for the other steps, like researching funders, sending out letters of inquiry, developing a full grant proposal, and submitting that proposal and managing the grant. And reporting is really about managing the grant, is about reporting at agreed upon intervals during the grant period about whether you did what you said you'd do. So just to make this really concrete, based on the chart that I just put up there, what's wrong with this approach? We went to the Kessev Foundation website. We noticed they've issued a request for proposals for a Jewish community arts and culture program. Let's create a program for that. We could get it funded. So if anyone can type in what's wrong with this approach?
We have no plan. We need the program first, grant second, not necessarily needed in the community. It should have been developed. You're designing a program around funding opportunities.
Yeah, right. Great. So yeah, so the point is that you want your program design to start by surveying the needs of your community. It should be proactive, thinking about where the needs are, thinking about what you do well, but rather than reactive to your funder. And by the way, I did not make this up. I mean, this is a fictionalized case, but someone told me about their organization seeking funding in this way. The problem is it's going to be hard if you do your program development in this way. You haven't yet shown that either that there is a need or that you can do this well. And so we'll talk about that in a minute. What's a better approach? Olive JCC has piloted our community arts and culture offerings for the last year with tremendous positive reception. The coordinator is a longtime arts programmer and relationship builder in our community. No other organization in our town does this kind of work. How can we get this funded to expand our programming? So now Olive JCC has developed their program. They've thought about why they do this well, and they're going to go out and seek funding. So what is program development specifically? It is documenting an unmet need that you are in a position to address. And taking that apart, an unmet need means someone isn't doing that already. Have you done research about similar programs or offerings? And you are in a position to address. There's some evidence based on your past work that you could deliver this. So one of the questions people ask me is how you can show that you're in a position to address a problem if you haven't created a program before. And I have a couple of responses. Piloting a program is one way to do it. So you may be able to create a program for a small number of people and then make it a lot bigger and get funding for it. Second of all, you may not have done it before at your JCC, but the team that you're hiring to do this work may have a combined 20 or 50 years of experience, and you would definitely want to mention that in your grant proposal. And third of all, you should show familiarity with different ways of working with the population that show your expertise. For example, your after-school program for special needs children will include a part-time staff person who will connect with parents, since this is critical to supporting participants and ensuring the success of the program. So you're showing by the choices you're making that you know about the population that you're working with, and you're doing thoughtful program design. Again, going back to our example, how is this good program design based on what I just described? There's a clear unmet need. No other organization in our town does this kind of work, this kind of arts and culture work. And there's evidence that Olive JCC is in a position to address this, a couple of pieces of evidence. They have piloted their community arts and culture offerings, and the coordinator is a longtime arts programmer and relationship builder. So next step, one good way to do this is something that I call the so what exercise. As you're designing a program, think about how will the world be better if this program receives funding? So someone mentioned a rock climbing wall for people with disabilities. If you start to think, so what? Well, okay, on the most basic level, more people with disabilities will be able to rock climb. That's nice. That's not going to stand out with the many needs that are out there. So go a little higher level. So what? Research has shown links between trying challenging activities like rock climbing and exhibiting confidence in the challenges of daily life. Now all of a sudden you're showing ways in which this program is going to impact people's lives in a much bigger way than just talking about rock climbing, or going even more broad. So what? A large community of people with, there are a large community of people with disabilities in our community. It's a Jewish value to serve all people. Our JCC wants to express this Jewish value. Now you've made a connection between a rock climbing wall and the values of your organization and really the larger values of the community. The proposal just, and your program just got a lot stronger. Next step, detailed funder research. So I'm going to ask you a question here, which is, what's your research style? Imagine you're seeking the best pizza restaurant in New York City. How do you discover it? If you can put that in the chat box. Help us find the best, how do you find the best pizza restaurant in New York City?
We have a lot of Google.
Okay.
Some Facebook, Google, Yelp, social media, word of mouth, walking around, asking friends, and more Google.
Okay, great, great, thank you. So the point of this is not, even though I'm on the West Coast, it's almost lunchtime. Well, I'm not looking for a pizza restaurant right now, but although that wouldn't help me here. But the point of this is, obviously, there are many ways to conduct research. You should be using all of them. Most people will start online. We'll start with thinking, when I ask this question, they'll start thinking about Yelp and online research. Another possibility is, as some people said, is word of mouth. And if you really want to get into it, maybe you have a friend's friend who's a chef. The point is, in funder research, like a lot of other things, to build a program, you want to use both those online resources and in-person resources. That friend's friend who's a chef could get you to a really excellent restaurant, and maybe a lot better than the one that happens to be mentioned on Yelp, or maybe not. But both avenues are worth trying. So very specifically, some sources for funder research include the Foundation Center database, a foundation website, which I'm going to talk about the Foundation Center in a minute. Once you've gotten into the Foundation Center database and have some ideas about funders, you can look at a foundation website or printed materials. You can use GuideStar, which is free for anyone as long as you log in, create a login. You can look at all Foundation 990 tax returns and grants.gov. Okay, so this is a screenshot from the Foundation directory online. And there are many, first of all, this is, you need to pay to buy a subscription if you want it to come to your computer, but it's available in many public libraries around the country. It really is, if you're doing some searching for funders, it's very much worthwhile to make a trip, whether it's an hour or a few hours, to a public library that has this foundation directory online, and to use it to search for funders. So some of the different ways you can search, I would start with your geographic focus, do a search in your area, look at fields of interest. It might be disabilities, arts and culture, whatever area you're interested in. And you also want to look, you could look at other organizations, the funders in your area of other Jewish organizations, the funders of other nearby JCCs. And don't assume you should only go to Jewish funders. It really depends how broad your program is, who you're serving. One idea that's pretty important is look for funders who have funded organizations that are similar to you, programs that are similar to yours. And that means in terms of interest and also in terms of organizational size. A while back, I worked with a small startup client with a health-related mission who sent me a list of her funders to learn more about. And I asked her where she got the list, and she told me that she copied it down from the donor wall of a large nearby hospital. I had to explain that these were not good prospects for her, and they were too big for the size of her organization. So a lot of organizations may have that same idea. if only we could get a grant from the Schusterman Foundation or a Jim Joseph Foundation. And one way to understand more realistically whether you are likely to get a grant from any foundation is to look at the average budget size of the organizations that they do fund. So is your JCC in the ballpark of the kinds of organizations that this foundation funds? Once you've spent some time on a foundation's website, you're trying to understand, what is the foundation interested in? Does your program meet their funding criteria? And is your JCC connected to this foundation in some way? When you look, you can usually see either on the foundation directory or on their website and see board members and see if you have some connections with board members of different foundations. So a picture of this, you're looking for the overlap between a funder's criteria and your program vision. Everyone is passionate about the work they do, but being passionate about your program is definitely not enough. From the funder perspective, the question is, does this align, or how does this align with our funding criteria? If there's no alignment, stop. Do not waste your time or think you can talk them into funding you. So funders have set their strategy, and if you don't fit, move on. Go find the next funder who is interested in the program that you're doing. And if you're not sure, you can reach out via phone or email. Worst case scenarios that you don't hear back. But these are people who are on the funder side, and it's certainly worth building relationships with. And that's the topic of step number 3, which is relationship-based funder research. So in the chat box, I'm going to ask you, who are the groups of people who are connected to your JCC?
We have members, employees, families, volunteers, board members, the community, vendors, partners,
Great.
government, foundation, federation.
Great. So I mean, it's obvious that you are working inside of a community with many different people who are connected to your community, to your JCC. And in the same way that you would reach out to these people for individual fundraising, you can, as appropriate, reach out to them for foundation funding. So you can look at, are there some people coming to your JCC who are on the board, who are on boards of foundations, who are connected to foundations in different ways? And another way of doing this is, are there networking events where you might meet some of the people, boards or staff members, who are the decision makers? Sometimes when you're writing a document like a grant proposal, you forget that there are people reading grant proposals and making decisions. And so the same kind of a strategy that a JCC might use for individual fundraising, of networking and connecting with people, is also worth using in terms of foundation and corporate fundraising. So next, a compelling needs statement. What kind of things do you want to do as you write up your need statement? You want to talk about, you want to relate the need to your JCC's mission and purpose. So for example, as a Jewish community center, we stand for inclusion. That's why we're investing in the inclusion program. You want to focus on the needs of those you are serving, not the needs of your JCC. I had someone who said to me, well, we need to fill our classrooms, and so that's why we want this grant. No, the grant is about how you're serving the community and the needs that are out there, not the needs of your organization. You're going to use evidence to describe the problem, situate the need or problem in a broader context, and describe factors contributing to the problem. So here's an example going back to our cultural arts programming. The 2013 Pew Survey on Jewish Identity found that a majority of those surveyed believe that being Jewish is more about culture and ancestry than religion. Cultural arts bring diverse individuals together to hear, create, and reflect on the stories and experiences that define community in all of its diversity. Yet our community offers few venues for Jewish cultural expression. Our research has indicated there's a large potential audience for these programs who may have no other connection with our JCC or Jewish life. So this statement brings in a lot of evidence, first of all, that there is interest in this, that there are people who are connecting with Jewish life through culture, that that there's a positive value to cultural arts, and that the community itself does not offer, at this point, doesn't offer many venues for Jewish cultural expression, and that there's a large potential audience. So again, there's a clear need here and evidence that the program is compelling and would likely be successful. Okay. You sent a bunch of different ideas that you are thinking about funding or thinking about requesting funding for, and I took some of the potential ideas that came from the pre-webinar survey, and I categorized them. I think that some ideas are more compelling than others, and I can explain a little bit about how I think about this. So the ideas that are more compelling, it's easier to bring in evidence to describe the problem and to situate the problem in a broader context. For example, refugee support. There's a lot of evidence that you could lean on or situate the problem in a broader context. So a strong proposal might show how refugee support will strengthen the internal and external community. Not to mention that you could talk about millions of people who are refugees and how are we responding, and all kinds of big picture concerns, and then link them to the work happening in your community pretty easily. On the less, oh yeah, one of the questions that came up was how to make the case if you're not reaching an underserved population. And I think that you can always talk about positive impact. So for example, an arts and culture program, there's evidence that people are connecting to Jewish identity through arts and culture. We've encountered demand for these kinds of programs, as mentioned in the example from the last slide. And this is a way for people the people we serve to hear the stories of others, all of that. Now, some of these ideas are important ideas, are important programs, but they're less compelling. So something like Israeli dance or Strider bikes, I don't yet see what the problem is that these programs are trying to solve. Strider bikes are wonderful. They do help children learn to ride their bikes really, really well. But I'm not clear in the big picture how the world will be different if we have more Strider bikes. Similarly, in terms of day camp scholarships, many foundations do not fund scholarships. Some do. You would need to check on that and look at the funding criteria really carefully. And then I put a category here called need to know more. So someone mentioned expanding their garden, and I would want to know why. Who are you serving? What's the need you're trying to address? Is anyone else doing this already? So are there questions about that?
I think we're okay.
Okay, great. Okay, so next up, clear goals and objectives. So we have a sense of goals and objectives. We do use these words in real life, but they have specific uses in the world of grants. So in the world out there, you might say, my goal is to be elected to office. But in the world of grants, we're gonna use these in really specific ways. So goals are broad statements. They can be idealistic and long-term beyond the grant period. A goal would be to eliminate poverty, to eliminate decrease racism or anti-Semitism. They're idealistic, long-term, not necessarily measurable. What does your JCC hope to achieve, big picture, and as you serve your community? And objectives are much more specific. They are realistic steps to achieving goals. They will answer questions like what, why, who, how, when. You could check if they could be validated or check if an objective was achieved. And again, they're SMART, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So to give you some examples of this, so a goal might be our Jewish cultural programs are known and appreciated throughout the community. And that's very general. That's not something that is going to happen overnight. It might take the next 5 to 10 years, or it might be something that continues as long as your JCC is in existence. But very specifically, an objective would be attendance at Jewish cultural programs will increase by 50% over the next year. You could track that, you could report it, you could set a number at the beginning and the end and show that you have made progress. Similarly, all aspects of our JCC will be welcoming and accommodating for individuals with special needs. That's a big picture idealistic statement. And it's wonderful. It's wonderful as something to stand behind, but what does it mean exactly? And that's where you get to the objective. Over the next year, 20 children and 20 adults with special needs will participate in new fitness programs and report that they are satisfied or highly satisfied with these programs. So again, objectives are very concrete, and you're gonna want to include both of them in your grant proposal, because your goals are about what is it you're aiming towards, and then the objective part of it is very specifically, here's how we're going to show that we are successful in doing this. So these have been the 5 steps to a fundable grant proposal. And here's some things that you could do with these 5 steps. So first of all, you could do more thinking about a program. How do you want to develop it? You could research funders. You could build some relationships, build more relationships with funders. And another possible next step would be to create a letter of inquiry, including a needs statement, goals and objectives. And I put a link in here that gives a sample letter of inquiry. So it provides a template and talks a little bit about the parts as well. So I want to ask you to put in the chat box, what's your first step?
We have flush out ideas, start to become more proactive with grants,
Mm-hmm.
Figure out a need in your community, convince my own company, research more funders, brainstorm.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. How we could get more funding.
Mm-hmm.
What will we do well that has a need?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great, great. So wonderful. So a couple of concluding things, and then I'm going to take questions too. So one thing is that there's going to be a second part to this webinar on December 14th. And one of the things that I will, if you join us for the second part, one of the things that I will ask is, how did you do with your first step? Were you able to make some progress? I put a lot of resources on grant writing on my website, which is reneerubinrossconsulting.com. So there's some resources about where to find grant funding, how to, a couple of books are listed if you want to learn more about the different parts of a grant. Also some websites that talk about, that give a lot of detail and some sample grants about that you can look at and really get a sense of how grants are structured. I have a post-webinar evaluation that you'll get after the webinar. I'm always interested in feedback. And again, you can join us on December 14th for part 2, the 5 do's and don'ts of grant proposal writing. So I'm gonna open this up now for questions. And Sarah, I know you've been collecting questions.
Hi. Yes, so I have some questions we received from the survey. One that came about a few times was, how do I make a grant proposal stand out?
Great. So a couple answers to that. First of all, I would say one way to make a grant proposal stand out is to do this 5 steps that I just mentioned very, very well. So, very thoughtful program planning, very detailed and relationship-based funder research, thoughtful and careful needs statement, and clear work on your goals and objectives. And I guess another way of stating that is, you can think about how are we as a JCC, how are we planning, and how are we learning? Because both of those are really important. The planning part is about how are you showing that this program that you want to get funded is really core to your priorities as a JCC. That's your planning. And it might be that, and also allocating the resources that you need for fundraising as a JCC, so that you're showing that this is important. And the learning part is really about, as we are creating and expanding our programs, how do we know that that they're having an impact and that they're successful? One of my clients that I work with, Citizen Film, an organization that I originally worked with at the Jim Joseph Foundation, and I've continued to do some grant strategy work for them. They do documentary filmmaking, and they train people to do documentary filmmaking around storytelling. And they talk about feedback loops, so that with a film, it's really easy to see, to get feedback on that film. People will come, and more people will come if it's good, and fewer people will come in the future, or to their programs if they're not good. But those feedback loops are really, really important for any program, to be able to have something that's going to help you to learn, are we approaching this in the right way? Are we effective? Are we utilizing best practices in programming? And doing that is something that will make your grant proposals that much more compelling and fundable.
Great. Let me go to the next question. How do you find new grants to apply for?
Yeah, again, there's no magic bullet. I would say that both of the strategies that I talked about in terms of funder research, going to the Foundation Center or using the database and really combing through it and looking for funders who are interested in the kinds of programs that your JCC is funding. But one of the things is, as I mentioned at the beginning, that this isn't only, you can use this information for both foundation or corporate funders as well as individual donors. So again, if you are building those relationships in the community and you have real clarity that this isn't a program about a rock climbing wall. This is a program about the value of inclusion at your JCC, then you can go find people who also care, people or foundations who also care about that.
Thanks. So I see a lot of questions on best practices when applying for grants. Is there like specific wording that people should be using, or how should they prioritize which grants they should apply for? Should they focus on the key interests of the funders or go from their perspective? Do you have advice on any of that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, again, going back to program design, I think that, you know, you want to show that the program that you are talking about in your grant proposal is something that is core to the mission of your JCC. From the funder perspective, I want to know that I'm making a good investment, that something that I'm funding you for isn't going to disappear next year because you decide that you're interested in something else, but rather that this is this is like the building block to something that is really important to the community, and that that you want to expand in the future and hopefully will have more impact. I mean, the best case scenario is, as a funder, is, you know, my $10,000 or my 50,000 or 200 or whatever it is, as an investment becomes something that later on becomes $1 million program. And I was there when, you know, seeing the quality of this program at the very beginning. So so all that is to say, to show that, you know, that you're thoughtful about what you're doing, that you're thoughtful and planful, that there's real sense of sustainability in the work that you're doing.
Great.
And just one more thing, Sarah, to add. I think that you can, you know, it's absolutely okay to, if you're, as you're building a relationship with a funder, and that and maybe you're interested in applying for a grant, or maybe you've had some conversations, ask them to see a sample grant. I think, you know, these things, I am in favor of as much transparency as possible. So you should look at sample grants online. There are many, many. You know, think about how you understand the arguments that people are making about different programs, and try to, and when you look at that whatever foundation website, or even the same way that you would talk to an individual donor and say, wow, this person really cares about children, you know, or some foundations are more fact and metric oriented, some are more in the emotional side. You want to understand the personality of the funder, whether individual or foundation or corporate, and, you know, and try to write your proposal up in a way that will match.
Thanks, Renee. I have a question coming in from Alana, who is on the webinar. When reaching out to individuals, how many times would you recommend to contact them for donations? Examples through letters, mail, call, email.
Yeah, you know what, I'm not, I would say that I would suggest, I'm really going to keep my focus here on grant writing and grant proposal submission. So I do a little bit of work in terms of individual fundraising, but I'm not an expert in that area. So I'm gonna, yeah.
Okay, let me see what else we have. Would you recommend involving a specialist or hiring a specific person devoted to writing grants, or do you think this is possible agency-wide?
I think there are a lot of different ways that people do it. The main first step would be determining that this is a priority of your JCC. And remember, that means that you're already spending the 72% of your time on individual donors, but you realize that you're at that next level, and it's worth spending 25%, 28% of your time, and I mean your time as a you know, as a whole JCC or whoever the staff is, on going after grants. So so then once you've done that, then you kind of look at, well, who do we have here? And do we have the capacity within our JCC, or do we need to, have somebody help us and, on a consulting basis? Certainly there are a lot of organizations where the executive director or the development director is the person who writes grants. And then sometimes the organization decides, we are, looking for another several $100,000 or whatever it is for a new program that's beyond what we've done up to now, and we don't have the capacity internally. But I think that it's a matter of kind of assessing, what kind of person power you have.
Great. Do you have any recommendations on wording? Are there keywords, adjectives, or um, things that the grant funders are looking for? Or do you think it's different dependent on the grant?
Yeah, I think I can't give you a magic word that will get your grant funded, but I think that, well, first of all, try not to be too jargony, just because you may lose somebody, because you don't know exactly who's going to be reading your grant. But on the other hand, what you want to do is you want to show your knowledge of whatever area you're talking about. And so that may involve some specific words that that describe the field that you're working in. So I mean, again, that would be my best advice. And for these government grants are really involved. There is a very detailed something called a theory of change, which is this kind of process of looking at, how will the world be different, and what are the steps that we see, 1, 2, 3, that that this funding is going to shift, and move the people we serve from point A to point B. So you should, the more that you have a model in your mind of we're doing this, and so that's going to make this happen, and then this is going to happen, and that's that's why it's worth funding this, the more successful your grant is likely to be.
Great. I just see one last question. This is from someone who is on the webinar. We sometimes identify foundations that seem to be a great fit for a particular program at our JCC. We'll
Mm-hmm.
apply year after year and always get the feedback. We loved your proposal, but received more applications than we could fund.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you know when to give up and when to move on if this continuously happens?
Oh, that's a great question. And good for you for hanging in there, man. I think that, I mean, as you describe this scenario, I would, well, if possible, I would try to get more feedback. I don't know if it's possible or not. It may be that it isn't. I would also look at what kinds of organizations did get funded. And again, if it turns out that all of the organizations that this foundation is funding are $10 million, in budget, and you're only 2 million, then maybe it's not the right fit. I think that I wouldn't, I would really try to understand, is there anything we could do that would make our proposal more fundable? Is there more evidence, or is there a way that we're not aligned? Or, if the organizations that are getting funded, why are they getting funded and we're not? I wouldn't try too many times, though. I think if it seems like you're just hitting a wall after a few rounds, I most likely would try to take a break and maybe come back to them after you've gone in a certain direction.
Great. And just one last question before we end here.
Mm-hmm.
How much do we have to reinvent the wheel when applying for grants for similar programs that have been funded before?
I mean, I think it depends. So, for example, It's hard to answer that question precisely without having exactly, I would want to, based on what you just said, I would want to ask more questions. But for example, you can send the same proposal to multiple funders and you don't have to reinvent them. Once you've created, let's say, a letter of inquiry about, and it's really strong and you have good language, and in my world, we sometimes call that the boilerplate language. You have really strong, compelling language. It's fine to send it to many different funders and just kind of customize it a little bit based on whether they are past, donors, or based on why you think it's aligned with with this particular funder's funding criteria. And in terms of if you've already applied for for a certain project, I would go back to well, you're most likely going to be doing some reporting and explain what you did. And yeah, I mean, it depends on the funder. Some funders are happy to continue to fund the food bank again and again and again, and it's always a need. And they're not going to say, okay, what are you doing differently this year? I mean, but then other ones will say, well, we want to see that you're learning from the program you just created, and so tell us a little bit what's new. So again, it does depend on the funder, and you'll have to do some continue that relationship building with your funder to really understand what it is that they're looking for. It's challenging because there is this emphasis on always finding something new to fund, and yet at the same time there are some real ongoing, I don't know if you want to call them chronic, needs that that are real. So it's a challenge.
Going back to that question, the example they gave is they might have the same mentality. If we've been funded before, we'll get it done again, or we'll get the funding again. Is it important to restate the new need?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think I think that I would err on the side of at least showing, what kind of learning happened from this program, from what you've done already. How are you learning? How are you planning? So, I think that funders would, find that helpful to see, okay, my money helped them to do this program, but also to shift it a little bit, and figure out how to do it, 10% better or 20% better. So I would never recommend sending the exact same proposal. It seems like you need to, do more thinking about why this, even just to say, why is this still important to you?
Great. Well, we're going to end within the next minute or so. I just want to thank you so much for this very informative webinar. If you haven't registered for the December 14th webinar, I could circulate the link on how to register for that. And I will also be sending a post-webinar evaluation right after we end here. So thank you so much, Renee, for your time.
You're welcome. You're welcome. I really enjoyed, speaking with everyone about the fun steps to a fundable grant proposal, and hope that you'll join in December for part 2.
Great. Thanks so much.
Sure. You're welcome.